Now we'll shift our focus to a building's architectural characteristics. The first one we will explore is the relationship of solids to voids in a wall, or the proportion of windows and door openings to wall surface area in the exterior wall of a building. Think of the windows as being the eyes of the building. When there are no or few openings in a building's wall, it seems forbidding, not inviting. When we look at a building, we could be aware of the proportion of blank walls to doors and windows. In other words, does the building have eyes? Articulation refers to the elements that project out or are recessed to create a more interesting and less monotonous appearance, as well as divide a building into parts that make it more human scale. Elements of articulation include awnings, balconies, bay windows, recessed doors, and other architectural details. The roof is a major visual element and should be carefully considered as to the proportion, texture, color, and compatibility with the proposed building style and those of neighboring buildings. Similarities in roof shape have the ability to create visual continuity in the streetscape. The building on the right is new construction, but because the roof shape and other architectural details are similar to the building on the left, it fits in with its neighbors even though it was built many years later. What kind of building material can be seen from the street? Brick? Stone? Wood? Metal? Concrete block? Plywood? Vinyl siding or other substances? Ornamentation and trim are decorative elements including tiles, shutters, glass block, stone or wood carving, columns or other features that add interest to a building. What colors are used in the building? Do they add or detract from the community's appearance? As noted in the book Design First, authors David Walters and Linda L. Brown refer to the architectural characteristics of shadow patterns on buildings, or the visual interest created by projections and setbacks. So far we've talked about where we feel at ease in our surroundings, basic design principles, how to create the feeling of being in an outdoor room, and the architectural characteristics of buildings. Next we'll talk about how buildings are placed on streets. At the turn of the previous century, cities and towns were designed for pedestrians. This meant that sidewalks were wide enough to accommodate groups of people, and buildings were placed next to sidewalks so those walking by could look into windows. Merchants prided themselves on attractive window displays to entice people walking by to come inside. Windows also had the advantage of promoting interaction between people walking by and those shopping or working inside. The buildings themselves were interesting to look at. Often they were built with patterns in the brickwork, had special carvings or other kinds of ornamentation on the facade to catch the eye of passers-by. The buildings were part of marketing the business. Buildings were designed to have an individual identity. They were also designed to fit in with the neighboring structures. Buildings were often constructed of materials that were available locally, so a regional type of architecture sometimes developed. Buildings were meant to be permanent. Property owners were generally local, so they wanted to build buildings that would reflect favorably on them, their families, and their businesses. When they built new buildings, they assumed these structures would be there for several generations. Many buildings were 2 or more stories high. Owners of the buildings sometimes had their store on the ground floor and lived upstairs, and later on they may have rented out their upstairs for office space. Buildings were built next to one another on the same block, so it was easy to walk from store to store. Signs were placed at heights and locations where people could see them from the street. They were attached to the face of the building and projected across the sidewalk. Trees were planted next to the curb. This provided shade for the people walking by and made the buildings cooler as well. On-street parking took care of the needs of the people who drove to town. Where tree lawns did not exist, author Crankshaw notes in Creating Vibrant Public Spaces that parked cars were the only physical obstruction between pedestrians and moving cars. In that sense, they provided a real buffer for pedestrians from passing traffic and added to their sense of security. The same can be said today. As we discussed earlier, the buildings and trees lining the streets formed an edge and gave a feeling of enclosure, like being in an outdoor room. Downtown was the heart of the community. Since it was the center for people to live, shop, work, and worship, There were civic buildings as well as public spaces for people to gather. These public buildings and spaces are also known as the public realm. Downtown was, and still is, the place to remember notable people and events. It's where our memories are made, where we commemorate our past, and where we continue to celebrate special events today. In such, the city of Georgetown, Delaware is known for hosting a Returns Day the Thursday after each election in the city's downtown district.